On the 6th day of the storm, 3 knocks came against the rock. Slow, deliberate, impossible, because nothing living should have been out there, in that white and screaming dark. A widow stood alone in the amber lamplight, her hand frozen on the bar of a great oak door. Behind her, more than 20 souls lay sleeping in the warm belly of the stone, and every single one of them had once called this place madness. They had mocked her, signed papers against her, taught their children she was a fool who built a house inside a cave. Now their children slept safe beneath her roof, while the world outside came apart. Her palm pressed flat against the wood. She felt no warmth on the other side, no voice, only that knock, 3 beats, then silence. She did not know yet who was kneeling in the snow beyond that door. She only knew she was about to open it. On the 6th day of the storm, a widow stood at the mouth of the hollow and listened to the world scream. The wind had not stopped for 5 days, but somewhere in the second night, she had stopped hearing it as noise. Now it was only pressure, a weight pressing down on the rock above her head, searching for a way in, searching for a weakness. It found none. The limestone swallowed the sound the way deep water swallows a stone. It took all that violence and gave back only stillness. Behind her, in the soft amber light of a single lamp, more than 20 people slept. She knew every one of them by name. She knew where they lived. She knew where they sat in church on Sunday mornings. And she knew exactly what they had called her hollow in the months before the storm came. The man who had signed the paper declaring her home unsafe was curled beneath a wool blanket near the far wall, his boots still damp. 3 children lay piled together near the small iron stove, breathing slow and even, the color back in their cheeks. Not one of these people would have carried a single plank of wood up this slope for her, not one. The woman turned back to the wall of white that sealed the entrance, and let herself remember how all of it had begun. It had begun on an ordinary morning, in the dust of a land office that smelled of old paper and ink. A man peered at her over the rim of his reading glasses. On the table between them lay a map of the parcels around the town. A small settlement pressed against a vast and open plain, like a splinter lodged in the palm of a giant hand. Most of the good land was already taken. What remained was the land other people had walked past for reasons they thought were obvious. Her finger moved across the map without hesitation, and stopped on a limestone ridge just north of the town line. Beside it, the surveyor had written 2 words, unsuitable for cultivation. There was a natural cavity in the southern face of the rock, a hole, marked with a small symbol that meant, plainly, worthless. The man looked up from the map, then back down, then up again. "That parcel is no good," he said. "The rock runs too close to the surface for plowing, and there is a rather large hole in the side of the bluff." The widow, whose name was Mara Ellison, folded her hands on the table. "That hole," she said, "is exactly what I want." He set down his glasses with the slow care of a man about to say something he believed was important. "Mrs. Ellison, you are talking about living in a cave." "I am talking," she said, "about building a house of timber and glass inside that cave." He studied her face for a long moment, looking, perhaps, for some sign she was joking. He found none. So he pressed the stamp into the wax, and the sound it made was the sound of a door closing. She was a woman of 52, not old, not young. Old enough that the town had already decided what her life was supposed to look like from here. A widow, alone. She had spent years in the field once, before all of it, reading the land the way other people read a page, feeling the logic of a hillside through the soles of her boots before she ever set a mark in her notebook. She understood what made ground useful, and she understood what made it dangerous. She had learned, out there, that these were often the same thing, seen from different distances. She walked out of the land office into the pale morning light, and she had gone perhaps 20 steps when a voice said her name. A woman stood in the shade of a covered porch. Handsome, careful hair, careful clothes, a woman who occupied the precise social temperature that let her say almost anything without ever once being called unkind. Vivian Crane. She came down the 2 steps with the measured pace of someone who had never walked in any direction without knowing exactly where she meant to arrive. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, warm as a lamp and cold as glass, "I hear you were speaking about that ridge this morning." "That's right." Vivian smiled. It was a very particular kind of smile. The kind that lives in the corners of a face and never quite reaches the center. "A town this young pays attention to the choices its neighbors make," she said. "A widow alone, on a rock, so far from everyone, that draws a certain kind of notice. Not all of it kind." She let that sit. "There is good soil near the creek, close to town. I could arrange it. I'm sure the price would be manageable." It was, the widow thought, a remarkable little piece of architecture, built in the space of 30 seconds. A warning, an alternative, and the suggestion that the warning was a gift. "I appreciate that," Mara said, "but I've already signed the papers." Something moved behind Vivian's eyes, there and gone. "Of course," she said. "Well, I hope it goes the way you're planning." She turned and went back up the steps, and nothing more was said, but something had passed between them. Something without a name, the way the air changes before a storm, long before the sky shows you anything at all. That night, the widow sat alone in a rented room above a shop and spread her old field map across the bed. She had been adding to this map for 2 years. Ever since the night everything went quiet, she traced the ridge with one finger and let herself think it through, the way she thought through everything now. The hollow faced south. In winter, the low sun would pour warmth straight into the mouth of it. The stone held a steady temperature, year-round, deep and unchanging. A kind of stillness no wooden house on an open plain could ever hold. She knew these things, not from books. Though she had read the books, she knew them from something else. She reached into her bag and took out a small square of folded paper. She had carried it for 2 years. She set it in the center of the ridge she had just signed her name to, and looked at it without opening it. She already knew what was written there. She had written it herself. Everett. He had gone out one winter evening to bring in firewood, an ordinary errand, the kind a man makes 100 times without a second thought. The door had swung shut behind him in a gust of wind. The latch had dropped, and the snow had packed against the base of it with a speed that only someone who had truly lived through a killing winter could ever believe. She had heard him strike the wood with his fist. She had thrown herself against the door from the inside, working the latch. But the drift had wedged it tight in the frame. She had screamed for him to run to the barn. She never knew if he heard her. She found out in the morning. It was not the storm that killed Everett, not the cold. It was a door, an ordinary door, in an ordinary house, built the ordinary way, on open ground, with no shelter, no thought ever given to the worst night, only the average one. The widow folded the paper along its worn creases and placed it gently back in the bottom of her bag. She turned the lamp down low, and in the dark she lay still and breathed. And for the first time in a very long while, she slept before midnight. She did not know, lying there, that the opposition had already begun. She did not know that the woman on the porch had already started to make her quiet calls, that doors were closing all over town, one soft conversation at a time. She only knew what the map had told her, that the ridge would hold, that the stone would keep, and that somewhere out there, a season was already turning toward her, slow and patient and certain. She just didn't know yet how much it would ask of her before it was through. The trouble began quietly, the way most cruelty does, not with a slammed door, not with a raised voice, but with something softer and colder and far harder to name. Within days of her visit to the land office, the men who hauled freight in and around that town received a social call, a warm one, a pleasant one, from a woman with careful hair and a careful voice, and a way of asking after your family that made you feel she truly wished to know. No one told the widow this. She learned of it the way you learn of a stone dropped into still water. Not from the stone itself, but from the ripples that reach the far shore, long after. When she went to arrange transport for her first load of timber, the price she was quoted came back nearly half again what she had been told to expect. She thought, at first, she had misheard. She asked the man to say it once more. He said it once more. And he did not look at her while he did. The second man she found said he was booked clear through the fall. The third listened to her describe the work, nodded along, and then, without quite meeting her eyes, said he made a policy of not hauling to unstable ground. Unstable ground. The phrase had a shape to it, a borrowed shape. It was not the way a freight man spoke of a hillside. It was the way a careful woman spoke of a widow. She stood alone in the street outside the livery and turned the words over in her hands like cold stones. She had the savings to pay the inflated rate if she was careful with every other coin she owned, but she could not pay it, and pay for the wool, and the glass, and the iron, and the nails. Not both. Not through a whole season. The town had found a way to stop her without ever once laying a hand on her, and she stood there, doing the quiet arithmetic of it, feeling the place close around her, soft and slow, like a fist closing in its sleep. That was when a shadow fell across the ground at her feet. A man leaned against the livery post, his arms crossed, a dented tin cup held loose in one hand. He was older, weathered in the way of men who have spent a lifetime out under open sky. His face gave away nothing at all, and somehow, in that town, that was its own kind of honesty. He watched more than he spoke, and when he spoke, it cost him something, so he made the words count. His name was Elias Crow. He lived out at the eastern edge of the settlement, past the point where the town's warmth began to thin into something colder. A carpenter, but not only a carpenter, the kind of craftsman whose work was so exact that even the men who would not sit at a table with him had been known to come knocking on his door when a joint had to be cut to a standard no other hand in the county could manage. He was treated the way small places treat a man whose skill they need, and whose presence they have quietly decided is a thing they permit, rather than welcome. He had seen a great deal of that in his life. It had made him patient, and it had made him watchful, and it had given him a particular tenderness toward anyone else the town had decided to look through. "Heard you mean to build up on the ridge," he said. "That's right." "Where are you setting the main bearing wall?" she told him. He turned the cup slowly in his hands, looked at the dust, then looked up at her, and there was something careful in it. A test, maybe, to see if she'd flinch. "Run your ridge beam along the length of the cave," he said, "and you can let the natural arch carry the load. Won't need as heavy a crown post that way." The widow looked at him for a long moment. "That's right," she said. Quiet, because he was right, and because it had been a very long time since anyone in that town had spoken to her as though she might know the difference. He set the cup down on the rail. "I've got an adze," he said, "and 2 good chisels, and nothing much happening until the leaves turn." He paused. "Understand me. I'm not offering because I think you're right. I don't know yet whether you're right. I'm offering because I've had my fill of the way this town decides what is and isn't a reasonable idea, and who's allowed to have one." The widow almost smiled. It had been a while since she'd done that too. "Those," she said, "are good enough reasons for me." They began in the heavy heat of late summer. The work was harder than she had planned for, and easier than the whole town assumed it would be. Elias was the kind of man who never used 2 motions where one would do. He wasted nothing, not effort, not lumber, not breath. And she had spent enough years of her own life in rough country to know how to move well in a hard place, how to save her back, how to lift with her legs, how to stop before the tiredness made her careless. They fell into a rhythm together, a quiet one, sunup to shadow, day after day. But let there be no mistake about whose house this was. Every choice was hers. She had drawn this place in the dark over 2 long years, in rented rooms, by lamplight, when the nights were too empty to sleep through. And thinking was the only thing left to do with her hands. Every beam, every angle, every seam and joint and pillar. Elias could see the sense of a thing the moment she spoke it aloud. He was too good a craftsman not to, but the seeing came second. The knowing had always been hers. She led, he followed, and he never once seemed to mind it, which, she came to understand, was its own rare kind of respect. They hauled pine from a small stand of timber to the east, cutting and seasoning as they went, so the wood would be ready when the frame called for it. Then they raised that frame inside the mouth of the hollow, posts and crossbeams, and the great limestone arch curving above them became a partner in the work, not a wall to fight against, but a vault to build beneath. The way the ceiling of a great hall holds the room below it, a thing that carries instead of a thing that presses down. The floor went up on stone pillars, cut from the bluff itself, lifting the whole living space clear of the ground. She had thought hard about that floor. Because damp rises through wood set flat on the earth until the boards go soft and the whole house begins, quietly, to rot from underneath. So she lifted it clear on the stone pillars and broke the path of the moisture completely. The walls went up in double layers, a hollow left between them. And into that hollow she packed raw wool bought from a rancher to the south, and packed it so tight that a hand laid flat against the outer wall on the coldest night of the year would feel nothing at all of the cold on the other side. She tested it herself with her own palm on the first frosty morning, and she felt only wood, only warmth, and something in her chest eased just slightly. The door took the most care of anything but the pipe. It was a slab of white oak, thick as a strong man's hand is wide, hung on iron hinges that Elias forged himself in a single long afternoon, the ring of his hammer carrying up the slope until the sun went down. It was heavy, heavy enough that she needed both her hands to swing it open, which was exactly the point. A light door can be pulled from its frame by the wind. A light door can be sealed shut by a drift of snow packed against its base in the space of a few cruel minutes. A light door can drop its latch behind a man and never let him back in. This one could not. She swung it that first time and felt its weight fight her honestly, and she thought, good. She wanted it heavy. She wanted a door that argued. She had learned, in the hardest way a person can learn anything, what a door was truly for. And then there was the pipe. She gave the most careful thought of all to the pipe that would carry the smoke up and out of the stove. She ran it through a natural crack in the limestone, high above the living space. She lined that channel with fitted stone, set by hand, each one chosen for its place. She sealed every joint with a mixture she had used long ago, in narrow dark places, underground, in the years before her life had folded in half. Because if that pipe failed, the problem would not be an inconvenience. The problem would be smoke, gathering, unseen, in a sealed room of stone, rising slow while people slept, filling the one small pocket of safe air with the very thing meant to keep them warm. So she tested it first with green, wet wood, watching the draw, watching the smoke clear, standing in her own doorway with a lamp, timing how fast the room emptied of the haze. She would not trust that pipe with a real fire until she had trusted it with a false one again and again until she was certain. Every part of that house was built for the worst night, not the average one. The average night had never taken anything from her. It was near the end of that summer that she found the marks. She had gone to the back of the hollow where the light from the entrance grew thin, and the ceiling came down close over her head. She was checking the seam where the built wall met the living rock, running her fingers along the joint, and her hand found something that was not stone and was not seam. She lifted her lamp, and there, cut into the limestone at just about the height of her own shoulder, were lines. Not cracks, not the slow, patient work of water, made, cut, on purpose, with a sharp tool, by a hand, a long, long time ago. She went very still as her eyes learned the shape of it in the low light, and the image came clear. A great, shaggy animal, rendered in a couple dozen sure, patient strokes, a circle above it, like a low sun or a full moon. And along the bottom, smaller marks she could not read at all. Elias came to stand beside her. He had heard her go quiet, and quiet from her had begun to mean something. He looked at the marks for a long while and said nothing. "Winter shelter," he said at last, his voice low, stripped of all decoration. "People came here to wait out the cold, long before this town had a name, long before either of us." The widow looked at the marks, then at him. "How long?" He only shook his head, slowly. "Long time." And she stood there in the lamplight, looking at that animal carved into the rock by hands turned to dust. And something turned over inside her chest. Because she understood, all at once, that she had not invented a single thing. She had not discovered a principle. She had not outthought anyone. She had remembered something, the way a person remembers a song they knew as a small child and had not sung in 40 years. Until the moment came when they needed it, and it rose up out of them whole. The knowledge had always been here, in this rock, left by people who had understood, without a single line of engineering, the one thing the town below her had forgotten. That you do not fight the winter. You listen to it, and you find the place where it cannot reach you, and you wait. The thought did not make her feel small. It made her feel less alone than she had felt in 2 long years. That same week, the men came, 4 of them, climbing the slope in the afternoon light, led by a man named Walter Boone. Boone was solid through the shoulders, his hands like something carved from oak themselves. He carried a reputation built on 30 years of raising square houses on flat ground all across that country. Good houses, honest houses. He was not a liar, and he was not a fool. He was something more dangerous than either. He was certain. He walked through the hollow slowly, saying nothing. He pressed his broad hand flat against the walls. He crouched down and studied the stone pillars beneath the floor. He looked at the joints for a long time. He tapped things and listened and moved on. Then he stood, and his eyes followed the pipe up into the crack in the rock, and his whole face changed. "That flue," he said, "is a hazard. Running smoke up through native stone in a sealed space like this one, you'll get a chimney fire you can't reach to fight, and smoke gathering thick before you ever see a flame, and no way out that isn't already full of it. This isn't clever. It's a grave with a door on it." The widow did not flinch. Not at the word, not even a little. "It is lined with fitted stone," she said evenly, "and sealed. I tested the draw and the smoke clearance for a week of mornings before the walls ever went up around it." Boone looked at the work again, longer this time. Then he looked at her. Then his eyes moved to Elias, standing near the entrance with his arms folded, quietly watching the whole of it. And something in Boone's jaw went tight at the sight of the 2 of them together, as though the pairing itself was another mark against her. "A house needs a proper foundation," he said, turning back. "Dug into the ground. Not this. Not perched up on rock. The freeze and the thaw will move it in ways you can't predict. And one spring, you'll wake to find your floor has walked away from your walls." "The frost reaches shallow in this stone," she answered, calm, certain. "The pillar bases are cut below it, and the mass of the bluff itself holds the temperature steady at the foundation, in a way open ground never can, no matter how deep you dig." Boone was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing he had truly come up that slope to say. "You're making a hard thing," he said. "Out of a simple one. A square house, on flat ground. That is what works out here. That is what has always worked." And he turned, and he left, his 3 men trailing behind him down the slope. And the widow went back to the corner shelf she had been building before they arrived, and she did not let her hands shake until they were well out of sight. 3 days later, she was summoned down to the land office. On the desk between her and the clerk lay a single document, Boone's name signed at the bottom of it. It declared her construction non-standard, in its foundation, in its flue, in the way it leaned against the natural rock instead of standing free on honest ground. And it concluded, in cool, official language, that the structure could not be certified under the town's standards, and that any soul who chose to live there did so without the protections the town extended to a proper home, which meant, in plainer words, that if the winter took her, the town would owe her nothing, not a search, not a shovel, not a prayer said over the drift. The widow picked the paper up and read it through to the very end, and then she noticed something. She held the page up just slightly toward the window light, and she looked at Boone's signature at the bottom, and she saw that the hand which had made it was not steady. She could see it plainly once she knew to look. The small stretch and waver in the letters, the faint tremor riding through the loop of the B, the tail of the E, the mark of a hand that was not fully behind the pressure it was applying to the page. She set the paper down on the desk, and in that quiet moment, she understood a thing that would stay with her all the long way into the storm still coming. Boone did not think she was wrong. Boone was afraid she was right, because a man who has raised 40 houses one single way cannot afford, cannot survive, the thought that there was a better way all along. If she was right, then every home he had ever built stood ready only for the average night, and somewhere out there, on some worst night still to come, that certainty of his would have a price, and it would not be him who paid it. It would be the family sleeping soundly inside his good, square, honest, ordinary walls. He could not let himself believe her. Believing her would cost him 30 years of his own life. So he had signed the paper, and his hand had trembled while he did it. The widow asked the clerk quietly for a copy to keep with her title. He made it. She thanked him, and she folded it, and walked back up the ridge, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt something closer to sorrow, for a proud man fighting the truth with a shaking hand. That evening, she did something quiet. She took Boone's certification notice, and she carried it to the entrance of the hollow, and she slid it beneath a flat stone into the narrow gap between the door frame and the living rock. And beside it, into that same dark gap, she laid the other paper, the folded one, the one she had carried against her for 2 years, Everett's name, and the date, 2 documents, lying against each other in the dark. One explaining why the hollow existed according to the careful rules of the town, the other explaining why it existed in truth. Elias found her sitting near the entrance an hour after full dark. He sat down beside her without being asked, and together they watched the first stars come out over the great plain below. After a long while, he spoke. "Does that paper change anything for you?" "No," she said. He nodded once. "Good." Below them, the lights of the town were small and steady, and scattered across the dark, Each one a window, each window a family, each family behind its good square walls, believing itself entirely safe. The wind moved through the tall grass on the ridge with a sound like something slowly breathing. The whispering came next. It did not arrive as an attack. It never does, from a woman like that one. It arrived, instead, dressed as concern. Vivian Crane began, in her particular, careful, unhurried way, to raise a question, softly, at the church gathering, across the counter of her store, whether that strange little house up on the ridge might not pose a danger to the whole town. "A fire," she said, her voice heavy with reluctance, traveling unseen through the hidden cracks in that rock. Why, it would be beyond anything the town's men could ever hope to fight. She only raised it, she said, because she cared. Because she lay awake thinking of the children. It was a clever thing to say. It was clever precisely because it could never be answered. You cannot argue a person out of a fear they have chosen to enjoy. And it was clever enough that the clerk, who was not a stupid man, but was a man who wished, above all things, for problems to solve themselves and leave him out of it, sent word up to Boone, asking for a second inspection. Boone came alone this time. No 3 men behind him, no audience, no performance for the town, and alone. He was a different creature. He moved through the hollow with real care and real attention, and something almost like honesty. He checked the pipe at 3 separate points along its length. He tapped the stone around the fissure and listened to what it told him. He held his bare hand near each joint, close, feeling for the smallest breath of escaping heat. He spent a long time at it, and he found nothing, because there was nothing to find. And then Elias stepped, quietly, into the space between Boone and the door. He did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. He simply came to stand there, in the entrance, with the unhurried weight of a man who has decided exactly where he means to stand and has no further questions about it. "You've come up here twice now," Elias said, "and twice you've found nothing you came looking for. You're not here about safety, Mr. Boone. You know that as well as I do. You're here because someone told you to come." Boone looked at him, flat, unreadable. Then he looked down at the pipe, and then at the open page of his notebook, and he wrote, in his careful hand, "No immediate hazard found, consistent with prior inspection." He closed the book, and he walked out, past Elias, and down the slope without one single word. That night, across the low table, in the amber light, Elias said a thing he had not said before. "He doesn't believe you're wrong," he said. "You know that now. He's afraid of what it means, if you're right." The widow turned it over slowly in the quiet. "And is that supposed to make me feel better?" she said, "about being inspected twice by a frightened man?" Elias looked at her, steady in the lamplight. "No," he said. "It's supposed to make you understand what kind of fight this actually is." And she did understand. The fight was not about foundations. It was not about flues or certifications or the shallow frost line in the limestone. The fight was about the ancient crime of being visibly different in a place small enough that every difference feels, to the people around you, like an accusation, like a question about their own lives that they never asked to be asked. And she was not merely different. She was a woman and a widow, and she had done a thing alone that the town's proudest men had said could not be done. And worst of all, unforgivably, she was right. But not every soul in that town had a closed hand. It was on a gray afternoon that a young woman came climbing up the slope. The widow saw her from a good distance, a slight figure in a thin brown coat, moving up the grade with the careful, uncertain step of someone unused to the terrain, and trying, too, not to be seen making the journey at all. The widow knew her a little from town. A young mother named Ruth Callan, wife to a farmer who worked a hard quarter section south of the creek. Mother to a small boy the widow had seen once, carried through the store, a child of perhaps 3, with a bright, watchful little face, and a cough that would not leave him. The widow did not go down to meet her. She stayed where she was, splitting kindling by the entrance, and let the young woman come at her own pace, and in her own time. Ruth Callan stopped in the mouth of the hollow, and she stood there, her hands at her sides, and she looked at the inside of that place the way people look at things that are not at all what they had expected. The small iron stove, no bigger than a milk crate, putting out its quiet, steady heat. The walls of stacked packed wood. Somewhere in a side chamber, a goat shifting its feet. Ruth walked to the wall, and she laid her open palm flat against the stone, and she held it there, and she looked at the stove, and then back at the wall, and then at the widow, and for almost a full minute she said nothing at all. Then, quietly, "My boy took ill in his lungs last winter. We couldn't get the house above freezing, not for 4 days during the worst of the cold." She did not finish the thought. She did not have to. The widow set down the hatchet. She did not explain the thermal mass of the stone. She did not describe the orientation of the hollow or the double walls or the 2 years of careful reasoning behind all of it. She simply walked the young mother slowly through the space, pointing at things with her hand, the way a craftsman points at a joint she is quietly proud of. "This," she said, at each place. Not why, just this. At the door, with the gray afternoon light behind her, Ruth turned, and she asked one question. "If a storm comes," she said, "a bad one, can I bring my boy up here?" The widow looked at her. "Come straight to the door," she said. "Don't stop on the slope. Whatever you see, whatever the wind does, don't stop until your hand is on the wood." Ruth nodded once, the nod of a woman who has made a decision and will not be talking herself back out of it, and she went back down the ridge. The house was finished before the first hard cold came down. On an ordinary afternoon, with the grass on the bluff just beginning to turn its late gold, they raised the last wall section and set it in place. And Elias drove the final peg into the crown post with 3 clean blows of a mallet. And the widow stood in the center of the finished room and listened. The wind was up there. She could hear it working across the ridge above her, pressing on the stone, searching along the edges for a way down and in. But inside, it was only a murmur, a thing acknowledged and set gently aside, the way a river acknowledges the shape of its bank, without ever once being stopped by it. She had built a quiet place. In a loud and open and merciless land, she had carved out one small room where the worst night could not reach. She thought of Everett. She thought of a door that would not open, and a fist against the wood, and a voice she could not hear over the wind, and the long, terrible morning after. And she thought, standing in her finished house, this door will open. This one always will. Then she carried her few belongings up the slope, and on a quiet evening, she stepped inside her hollow and swung the great oak door shut behind her and dropped the heavy bar into its iron cradle. And the town below noted this with a kind of collective shrug, a shrug that had, buried somewhere underneath it, a quality of waiting. They were waiting for her to fail. They were waiting for the season to prove what common sense already knew. What they had not understood, what not one of them had thought to understand, was that they were all of them waiting for the very same thing, and that only a single person among the whole of them had thought to prepare for it. The widow knew better. She had been taught otherwise, in the one way no one ever forgets. So she settled into the stone, and she watched the sky, and each morning, in a careful hand, she began to write down the small, quiet things the world was telling her, the weight of the air, the birds on the ridge, the restless shifting of the horse in its stall, hoof to hoof, in the dark before dawn. Small numbers, meaning nothing at all, until the day, still weeks away, when they would mean everything. The cold came down in earnest as the season turned, not the sharp, honest cold of an ordinary winter, something flatter, something more absolute, as though the temperature had stopped rising and falling between the day and the night, and had simply settled and stayed in one fixed and lifeless place, a place below which nothing moved, below which nothing stirred. The widow noticed it the way she noticed most things now, not by feeling it, by measuring it. Each morning, she set a shallow pan of water near the door, and each morning she measured the ice that had formed across its surface with a carpenter's rule and wrote the number down in her book and said nothing about it, because the number was the thing being said. The town, down below, barely noticed the change at all, but familiarity and knowledge are two different things, and the distance between them does not show itself until the season decides, in its own time, to show it to you. And by then, for many people, it is already far too late to learn. It was in the deep of that cold the schoolroom entered the fight. The teacher was a woman named Clara Whitfield, and she was not a cruel woman. That is the thing that must be understood about her. Before anything else, she was something more ordinary than cruel, and in its own quiet way, something more dangerous. She was a woman who believed that certainty was itself a kind of virtue. She was the only teacher for a great many miles in any direction, and her whole standing in that town rested upon two pillars, her learning and her conviction, each one holding the other up. In ordinary times, this made her very good at her work. Children learned from her. Parents trusted her. But in times that were not ordinary, that same certainty made her capable of a particular kind of harm. The harm that comes from a person who has never once had cause to doubt themselves. She did not name the widow in her lesson. She was far too careful for that, far too respectable. She spoke instead of a kind of person, a hypothetical settler, someone who, having suffered a great and terrible loss, had allowed their grief to bend the straight line of their judgment. Someone who had turned their back on the methods of civilized living and crawled backward into the very ways the human race had spent long centuries climbing up out of. The cave, she told the children, was a symbol of fear, not of wisdom. Progress, she said, meant walking out onto the open land with your head held high and your face to the wind. It did not mean hiding from the world inside a rock, like something frightened, like something that had already given up. And she said one thing more. She said that a person who could not tell the difference between the hardship of this country and the right and proper way to answer that hardship was likely to pass that same confusion along to anyone foolish enough to sit and listen. The children carried it home the way children carry everything home, whole and unexamined, and repeated near word for word. The parents repeated it at the feed store, and at the church door on a cold Sunday, and across the counter of a certain general store to a certain careful woman with careful hair, who received each repetition with a small and satisfied nod, and said nothing at all to encourage it, and everything to keep it alive. By the deep of that winter, the house up on the ridge had two names in the mouth of the town. Only one of them was even close to polite. The widow heard of the lesson from Ruth. The young mother came up the slope on a bitter gray morning, snow riding the thin shoulders of her coat. And she told the widow what her own husband had said at their table, what her husband had heard from another man, what that man's own children had carried home in their small mouths from the schoolroom. Ruth watched the widow's face the whole time she spoke, looking perhaps for the wound to show itself. The widow was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She is teaching what she knows." Ruth blinked at that. "The trouble," the widow went on evenly, "is that she doesn't yet know what she doesn't know. And that is not a wickedness. It is only a blindness. And the winter has a particular way of curing that kind." Ruth studied her a long moment. "That is very forgiving of you." "It isn't forgiveness," the widow said. "It's only an accurate account of where things stand." But she did not say the rest of it. The wrongness in the season had been building for weeks, and the widow had been watching every hour of it. It was not a dramatic thing. It did not announce itself to anyone who paid only a casual, passing attention to the sky. It showed itself in small deviations, little breaks in the patterns she had been tracking morning upon morning in her careful book. The weight of the air dropping in ways it had no ordinary reason to drop. The birds along the ridge growing fewer and quieter day by day. The horse growing restless in the long dark before the dawn. And the quality of the cold itself, which had shifted in those last still weeks out of the ordinary biting cold of the season and into that flatter, deeper, more absolute thing. A cold that had stopped its breathing, a cold that seemed, to her, to be waiting for something. Then, on one gray and windless morning, 3 of the signs came true at once. The birds were gone from the ridge. Not fewer. Gone. The kind of complete absence that is, itself, a message. The weight of the air had fallen hard between the evening's reading and the morning's. A drop she had seen only one other time in the whole of her life, years ago, in another country of her memory, a country of survey camps and open work. Some 2 days before a thing came through that shut down everything and everyone for the better part of 2 weeks. And the horse, calm in near enough every condition she had ever known it in. That horse had been pressing and shifting against the boards of its stall since well before first light, not from fear, from something older and deeper than fear. The particular focused restlessness of an animal whose blood is tracking a thing that its keeper has not yet been able to confirm with her own eyes. The widow closed her book, and she sat with both her hands laid flat on the table for one long and perfectly still moment, and then she rose, because there was a great deal of work to do, and there was very little time now in which to do it. She rode down into the town that day, but not in alarm. Panic in a small place is a contagion. It spreads faster than any weather ever could, and it does more lasting damage to a person's good name than any storm on earth. So she moved through the town with a deliberate and unhurried calm, and she let no fear show on her face. She bought dried meat and lamp oil, and several lengths of good rope, taking care to buy each thing the way a sensible woman buys in any hard season, steadily, plainly, drawing not one extra eye to herself. She arranged for a load of split cordwood to be carried to the foot of the ridge that very afternoon, paid for in full, in advance, and she said not one word about the reason behind it. And then she went to find Boone. She found him at the mill, standing over the cutting of a long roof beam, 3 hired men working beneath his eye. And she did not walk up to him as a woman seeking, at last, to be proven right. She came to where he stood, and she waited quietly for him to take notice of her, which he did after a moment, with the face of a man who has already decided that whatever is coming is going to be an inconvenience to his afternoon. "There is a storm coming," she said, "a hard one, inside of 2 days by my reckoning. Perhaps sooner than that." Boone said nothing. "You have houses in this town," she went on, steady, with long roof spans carrying their whole load out over the north face. "In a sustained high wind, I would not trust a one of them. You should go now and look at them, today, if there is any way you can manage it." Around them, the mill went on with all its noise. One of the men glanced over at the 2 of them, and then, quickly, looked away again. Boone set down his rule on the beam. "It is winter," he said. "It is cold out. The sky is gray. None of that is news, Mrs. Ellison. Not to me. Not to anybody in this town. I have kept a daily record since the leaves first turned," she said. "And the change in the air, these last hours, is not the change of an ordinary cold stretch. I have seen this exact fall one time before in my life, and I remember very clearly what came after it. Something shifted then behind Boone's eyes, just for the length of a single breath. Something that might, in a different man, have been the very beginning of listening. And then it closed over again, the way a heavy door closes. "That ridge of yours," he said, and not unkindly, which was somehow the very worst of it, "has a way of making a person see things larger than they truly are. Living up there, all alone, the way you do. It works on the mind. Over time, it magnifies." He said it the way a man states a plain and settled fact that he is entirely certain of. And that was the thing that stayed with her. As she turned to leave, she stopped at the wide mill door, and she turned back once to face the 3 men who had been standing there, listening to all of it. "If I am wrong," she said, "you lose nothing at all by going home and checking your own roofs. An hour of your day. Nothing more." She let that hang in the cold air a moment. And if I am right, she looked at each of them in turn. You will remember this conversation for the rest of your lives. Then she went out, and she climbed back onto the horse, and she rode up the long slope toward the ridge. And behind her, at the mill, at least one of those three men stood a moment longer than he had any need to, looking north, at a sky that told him nothing. Yet, the rest of that day moved with a controlled and a rehearsed and a terrible kind of urgency. She filled every last vessel in the hollow with water. She packed the side chamber with hay, far beyond what the animals could possibly need across an ordinary week. She carried in days of split wood and stacked it, high and dry, in the entrance chamber, which she had built deep, deliberately, from the very first day, to serve as exactly this when the time came: a staging ground, a held breath, a room between the world and the fire. She checked every seal on every window with her fingers. She checked the great oak door on its heavy hinges and the bar in its iron cradle, and she swung it once and felt its honest weight fight her, and was glad of it. She went over the pipe, joint by joint, along its whole length, with her bare hand, feeling in the dark for anything that might have shifted, or loosened, or opened in the long months since she had first set it into the living rock. Elias came up in the late afternoon, without being sent for. He took one long look at the work already well underway, and he did not ask a single question. He had been watching the same gray sky she had been watching since noon. He picked up the heaviest coil of rope from beside the entrance, and he began, without a word, to make one end of it fast to the iron anchor she had set deep into the ridge rock, back in the warm and easy days. For a reason she had never once spoken aloud to any living soul. He ran the rope down the slope, parallel to the fence line, all the long way to the road below. He did not ask her why, because he already understood why. The fence alone would not be enough, not in the kind of blinding white the widow believed was coming for them. A fence you must find with your eyes, or find by luck, by stumbling into it. But a rope you can seize with both your hands, in the dark, in the blind, with your eyes shut hard against the driving wind. A rope like that is the whole difference in the world. The difference between a frozen hand at last finding the door and a stumbling body walking on past it. Out into the open, out into the nothing, out into the same white that had once taken everything from her. She had built the fence in the warm season for reasons that any soul could name aloud, but she had set that iron anchor for reasons she had told no one. A private calculation, made long ago in the quiet, about what might someday be needed on this slope, and about who someday might come climbing up it, needing to be found. She had kept it to herself, all of it, because to have said it aloud would have sounded like prophecy, or worse, like arrogance. And she had been trying, through all of this, so very hard, to be neither of those things. That night, before she put out the lamp, she did a thing she had not done in 2 years. She took down a worn field book from the shelf. Not her own. His. Everett's. She opened it to the last page his hand had ever marked. His writing there, quick and slanting and terribly alive. Some ordinary little note about ordinary work. A thing that had mattered once, to no one in all the world but the two of them. She had read that page many times over the years. She read it once more now. Then she closed the book, gently, and she set it back on the shelf, with its worn spine resting against the spine of her own. The two of them, just touching, there in the dark. And she reached over, and she turned out the lamp. She slept only a few short hours, and she woke deep in the black heart of the night to a sound she did not, at first, understand. Because it was not the sound of the wind. It was the sound of the wind stopping, that strange, pressed, waiting silence that comes just before the front arrives, as though the whole of the air had drawn in one long, deep breath and was holding it, before it finally spoke at full and terrible volume. She dressed in the dark, quick and sure. She had the stove loaded and drawing well before the first true sound reached the hollow. A low vibration, felt from far off, felt more in the chest and behind the ears than truly heard at all. A pressure, a coming thing. And then it arrived. It was not a roar. It was not what stories make of such things. It was a sustained, many-throated wall of sound. The sound of a vast force working itself against every edge and every surface that it could find all at once, without rest, without pause, without any mercy at all held anywhere within it. A sound at once utterly wild and yet perfectly, coldly mechanical, because the thing that made it did not choose and did not tire and did not care. It only pressed, with the flat, endless, patient force of a weight that has all the time in the whole world and nowhere else it needs to be. Inside the hollow, the limestone took that sound, and it did what it had always done, since long before her time, since long before the town below had a name. It swallowed the worst of it. It carried the violence away down into the deep of the rock, and it left behind in the small lit room only a murmur, only a presence, a thing acknowledged and set gently aside. The cold near the entrance dropped hard in the first hour. She wrote the number down, out of habit, out of who she was. The cold at the back wall of the living space did not move at all. She sat down in the chair nearest the stove, and she listened to the hollow breathe around her, and she waited for what she already knew in her bones was coming up the slope through the white. It came in the second hour of the storm, a shape in the mouth of the entrance chamber. Ruth Callan, her small boy bound tight against her chest with a doubled length of cloth, his little face buried deep down in the collar of her coat. And she was moving with the shaking, staggering gait of a person who has been out in the killing cold just long enough for the body to begin losing its finer control, its careful edges. She had followed the fence to the rope, and the rope to the door, exactly as the widow had told her on a gray afternoon weeks before. Exactly as the widow had built it all months before that, for precisely exactly this. The widow was on her feet at once. She got the child free of the wound cloth, and his small face, when it finally came clear, was pale, but not white, not yet, which meant the cold had not gone all the way down into him, which meant there was still time. She did not put him near the stove. She knew far better than that. A cold body brought too fast to heat. The small vessels near the skin wake and open before the deep core has had its chance to steady, and the blood runs the wrong way through the body. And the very worst of the harm is done in the act of trying to help. She had watched a man make that mistake once, long ago, in a hard and unforgiving country. She had watched what it cost him. So she wrapped the boy against her own warm chest, and she gave him the slow and the patient warmth of her own body and the gentle ambient warmth of the room, and she walked with him, slow, back and forth, letting the heat find its way into him at the only pace the small body could safely bear. Ruth sank down onto the bench, both her hands wrapped around a tin cup of warmed water, and for a long while she could not speak at all. Then, finally, in pieces, "The road's gone. I couldn't see past the front of my own house. I followed the fence with my hand, and then the rope was just there, right where my fingers were reaching." She lifted her eyes to the widow. "I've wondered about that rope," she said, "since the very day you strung it. Why a woman would run a heavy line down a bare slope with nothing to tie off at the bottom, nothing to fence in, nothing to hold." The widow said nothing. The boy, against her shoulder, made a small sound. Not a cry. Something earlier than a cry. A thin, insistent, complaining little sound. And it was, in that moment, the most welcome sound in all the world, because it meant the warmth had reached him. It meant his small body had noticed the change and objected to it, and was alive enough and strong enough to say so out loud. Outside, something struck the ridge above the hollow, a hard, brief shudder traveling down through the stone overhead. Not a crack, not the house, only some torn and broken thing, carried at great speed on the wind, breaking itself apart against the rock face, far up above them. The widow did not look up. She already knew the hollow would hold. She had chosen this one place, above every other place in the wide world, for exactly and precisely what lay above it, and around it, and beneath it. What she did not yet know was what was happening down below, down on the flat and open and unsheltered ground of the town, where the storm was finding no ridge at all to break its long running start, no rock to scatter and divide its force, no hollow anywhere to take its violence into itself, and hand back, in exchange, only stillness. She would learn all of that later, in pieces, from the people who would come climbing up out of the white in the hard days ahead, each one of them carrying up the slope a single broken piece of the very same story. But in that second hour, all she knew was this: the boy in her arms had stopped his shaking. His mother, across the small room, had closed her eyes. For the very first time in many hours, the stove burned low and steady and sure, and the room held. It held at a warmth where no one, not the mother, not the child, not the widow the whole town had named a fool, was going to die that night. And that was enough. For now. For this 1 hour in the long dark. It was enough. And beyond the great oak door, the storm went on, blind and patient and endless, pressing itself upon the ancient stone, searching, as it had searched from the very first moment, along every edge for a way in, and finding, as it had found from the very first moment, none. The storm did not stop. It only deepened. By the third day, the widow had given up counting the hours. There was no use left in it. The hours all sounded exactly the same now. One long, gray, howling thing, with no seam in it anywhere to mark where one ended and the next began. So she began, instead, to count the things that mattered. The wood stacked in the entrance chamber, the water standing in the vessels along the wall, the level of the hay in the crib, the dried meat in the side stores. These were the numbers that meant something now. Time was only worth anything to her insofar as it changed these other numbers, and it changed them slowly, which was its own small mercy, the only mercy the storm had shown anyone at all. Elias slept in the entrance chamber. It was the colder room, by far. He had claimed it without discussion, without so much as a word about it, leaving the warm main room to Ruth and the boy, and to the others as they came. And through the long gray days, he moved quietly through his small tasks, checking the rope anchor at the mouth of the hollow, tightening the great door bar, keeping the animals fed and watered, and calm in their chamber. He did not complain. Not once. He did not speak much at all. He was the kind of man whose whole worth shows itself most clearly in exactly these conditions, where the only true measure of a person is the distance between what needs doing and what actually gets done. And in that measure, Elias Crow was worth 10 of the men who would not sit at a table with him down in the town. On the third night, after Ruth and the boy had finally fallen asleep, Elias came and sat near the widow in the main room. The lamp was turned down low. Outside, the storm went on, doing the only thing it had ever known how to do. For a long while, neither of them spoke. There was a kind of ease in it, the ease of two people who no longer need to fill a silence to prove that they are comfortable inside it. "What are you thinking about?" he said at last. The widow was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A man who went out one evening to bring in the firewood." Elias did not ask her to explain. He simply sat with the words. Let them be exactly what they were. The lamp made a small private sound. Somewhere in the side chamber, one of the goats shifted its weight, hoof to hoof, in the dark. Then Elias spoke, quietly, almost gently. "You built the door for him." It was not a question, and the widow did not answer it as one. She only looked into the small, steady flame of the lamp, and nodded. Once, the single motion that holds, folded up inside it, everything a person has spent 2 long years being unable to say out loud. The silence that came after that was not an empty thing. It was the kind of silence that only forms between two people who have been through enough hard hours together, that quiet no longer asks to be filled with anything at all. They sat in it, and the storm went on, and the lamp burned low and true between them. And then a sound came out of the entrance chamber, a sound that was not the storm, and was not the animals, and was not any of the dozen things the widow had spent 3 long days teaching her ear to expect. It was a knock, 3 impacts, rhythmic, deliberate, against the outer rock wall of the hollow, not the wind. The wind did not knock in 3s. The wind was many things, cruel and tireless and blind, but it had no rhythm in it, no intention, and this had intention. Elias was already on his feet. The widow was already reaching for the lamp. She turned it up, and the shadows fell back off the walls, and she crossed into the cold of the entrance chamber, and she laid her hand flat against the great bar of the oak door. And there she paused, just for a single moment, her palm flat against the wood, feeling nothing at all coming through it. No warmth, no vibration, only the honest, solid weight of the thing she had built with her own 2 hands to hold. She lifted the bar. She pulled the great door open. The figure on the other side of the door was not standing. Walter Boone was down on his knees in the driven snow, his 2 hands pressed flat against the rock face of the entrance, using the cold stone itself to hold his body upright. The way a man leans on a wall when his legs have finally, at long last, decided that they are done. His son was crouched close beside him, a broad young man, built through the shoulders just like his father, one arm thrown hard around the older man's back, the other hand locked white-knuckled around the rope the widow had run down that slope months and months ago, for reasons not one soul in that town had been able to understand. Both of them were packed with snow to the shoulders, not snow that had fallen upon them, snow that had been driven into them, horizontal and merciless and endless, filling every fold and every crease of their clothing until the cloth weighed 2, 3 times over what any cloth should ever be made to weigh. Boone's face was the color of old candle wax. His lips had cracked and bled, and the blood had frozen there in the creases. And his hands, when the widow took hold of them to pull him in through the entrance, had the terrible stiffness of leather that has been left out overnight in cold water. There was almost no give in them at all. Elias took the son. The widow took the father. And between them, they brought the 2 men through into the entrance chamber and pushed the outer door shut against the screaming White and dropped the heavy bar back into its iron cradle. And for one long moment, all 4 of them simply stood and breathed the air of the hollow. Air that was warmer than the outside by just exactly enough to register at once and sharply and almost painfully on skin that had been out in that killing wind for far, far too long. Boone could not speak for several minutes. The widow did not press him. She worked his frozen coat down off his shoulders, and she wrapped a dry wool blanket around him in its place, and she took his stiff, cold, ruined hands, and she held them between her own 2 hands. Held them. She did not rub them, because friction on tissue that cold does harm, and not good. She had learned that once, long ago, in a hard and unforgiving place, and she applied the knowledge now quietly, without once stopping to explain it to anyone. And when Boone finally spoke, his voice came out in broken pieces, the way a man's speech comes when his jaw is still half locked shut with the cold. "My wife," he said, "my children, 3 of them, they're still in the house." He lifted his eyes to her face. "The door," he said. "The door wouldn't open. The snow packed it shut against the frame. I pulled until my hands—" He looked down at them, held there between hers. "I couldn't get it open. I couldn't get to them." And there it was. The widow looked up at Elias over the top of Boone's bowed white head. She did not need to say a single word, and neither did he, because they both understood in that same instant exactly what Boone had just described to them. A door, packed solid shut with driven snow. A family trapped on the wrong side of it. A man's own fists beating against wood that would not give. It was the widow's oldest nightmare. It was the very thing that had made her. And now it was being spoken back to her, out loud, in the broken and desperate voice of the very man who had signed his name to the paper that called her home a mad woman's mistake. The world, she thought, has a terrible way of closing its circles. Elias was already moving to the equipment corner. He was already pulling his outer coat back on over his shoulders. He lifted the second heavy coil of rope down from its peg on the wall without being asked to, and he took up the single short spade and strapped it across his back with a practiced hand. The widow was reaching for her own coat. Boone's son came up off the bench. "You can't go back out there," he said, and his young voice cracked clean through the middle of it. "You can't. We nearly lost the rope on the way up here. There's nothing out there. You can't see. You take 3 steps from the door, and the whole world just ends. It just ends." "We'll follow the rope down," the widow said, calm, buttoning her coat, one button at a time. "And the fence line along to the road, and then the fence to the house." She looked at him steadily. "Which section of fence runs closest to your father's door? Tell me. Exactly." The young man stared at her, and then, because there was nothing else in the world left for him to do, he told her. She fixed it in her mind, the way she had once fixed 10,000 contour lines and survey marks into that same clear and orderly mind, out in the field, in another life. And she did not permit herself, even for one instant, to doubt it. Then she knotted the second rope to the first at the entrance anchor, adding another long reach to the line. She looped the working end around her own waist and tied it off firm. And she passed the middle length across to Elias, who tied it at his own chest, without a word, and without needing to be shown how. Boone tried to rise, to go out with them, to his own family. His legs would not carry him. They buckled beneath him, and he sat back down, hard, and a sound of pure, helpless anguish came out of him. "Stay," the widow said, not unkindly. She crouched for a moment to his level. "Listen to me. You'll do them more good alive, by this stove, than frozen out on that slope. Warm your hands, get your legs back under you, and be ready. Be ready when they come through that door, because they are going to come through that door." She held his eyes until he believed her, or until he chose to, and then she and Elias went out into the white. What struck her first was not the cold, though the cold was total and immediate and absolute, a thing that reached through the coat and the wool and the skin and closed its hand around the very bone. It was the noise. Inside the hollow, for 3 long days, the storm had been a background thing, a murmur, a presence, known and named, and set gently aside in the corner of the mind. Out in it, the sound had a body. It pressed on the ears and the chest at the very same time, and it moved. It was not one single fixed roar. It was a shifting, hunting, living thing, changing its direction by small degrees every few seconds, as the wind found new surfaces to tear itself against, new edges to scream across. It came from everywhere at once. It came from inside her own skull. She kept her left hand married to the rope, and she moved. The fence rose up out of the white exactly where she had known that it would, exactly where she had set it in the warm and easy days. And she followed it, her right hand trailing along the top rail, her left hand never once leaving the rope. And Elias came 3 steps behind her and just to her left. and the two of them moved that way, down the long slope, toward the road, with the deliberate and unhurried slowness of two people who understood, all the way down in their bones, that speed was not the thing that would keep them alive out here. Care was. Patience was. The house was the second structure past the feed store junction. She knew this from 100 easy rides past it in warmer, kinder days. She found the front wall of it by very nearly walking her own face straight into it, throwing her free hand out just in time to feel the rough siding under her palm. And she moved along that wall, hand over hand, to where the door had to be. And she found it, the way she had known, with a sick and certain dread that she was going to find it, by the resistance, a solid drift of packed snow, sealing the whole lower third of the door tight into its frame. And she understood then, with a clarity that had nothing abstract in it at all, nothing distant, nothing merely remembered. She understood, with her whole body, exactly what this looked like from the inside, because she had lived the inside of this. She had been the fists against the wood. They dug. They had the one short spade between them, and they worked it in turns, one digging, hard and fast and desperate, while the other braced against the wall and held the rope anchored and kept them both tied fast to the world. The wind tried to fill the hole back in as fast as they could clear it. They dug faster. The widow's arms began to burn. She ignored them. Elias took the spade from her hand and dug and gave it back, and she dug again. And the cold reached down into her chest and squeezed, and she ignored that too. And at last the base of the door came clear, and the widow set her shoulder and all of her weight against the frame and worked the frozen latch and pulled, and the door came open, swinging outward into the little space they had fought clear of the snow. The inside of the house was dim and very cold. Not the cold of the outside. Something worse in its way. The settled, still, hopeless cold of a space that has been quietly bleeding out its warmth for so many hours that the very walls and the furniture and the floorboards have all given up whatever heat they once held and made their cold peace with the air. The stove in the corner had burned all the way down to gray ash. The widow saw in a single glance that this house had perhaps one more day left in it, maybe less than that. At the rate it was losing what little warmth remained, it would not have kept a family alive to see the far side of the storm. The house Boone built. The good, square, honest house. Failing exactly the way she had told him a house like it might fail on the day he stood in her hollow and called her a fool for building otherwise. She took no pleasure in it, none at all. There was no room in her, in that moment, for anything but the work. And there, in the center of the room, down on the floor, sat a woman, Boone's wife, with all three of her children pressed in tight against her body, 2 girls and a small boy. Wrapped in every blanket, every coat, every last stitch of cloth the whole family owned between them. She looked up when the door came open, and her face moved from terror to something so far, far past ordinary relief that the widow could not have found a name for the country it had traveled through to get there. The smallest one, the boy, was tucked away underneath the kitchen table. 2 blankets wound around him, his small knees drawn up hard to his chest. He looked out at the widow, and he did not say a single word. She went to him, straight to him. It was the instinct that came from somewhere far below all thought, all reason, all planning. She crouched down low, right down to his level, so that her own eyes were even with his eyes, and he looked back at her with the terrible, quiet seriousness of a child who has been frightened for so long that the fear has stopped being a sharp thing and has simply become the weather of his whole small world. No longer acute, no longer a scream, just always there now. The air he breathed. She held out her hand to him. For a long moment, he only looked at it, and then he reached out, and he took it. His small, cold fingers closed around hers, and something in the widow's chest, some old and frozen thing she had carried for 2 winters, cracked just slightly and let in the smallest thread of warmth. They moved the family out as one single linked chain, the mother carrying the smallest child against her. The widow at the very front, both her hands married to the rope. Elias at the rear, with the 2 older girls held safe between his body and the mother's, and all of them bound together by the rope and by the fence, and by the slow, terrible 40-minute climb back up a slope that felt, to the widow, like the very longest single distance she had ever crossed on foot in the whole of her long life. Halfway up the grade, her boot found ice hidden away beneath the fresh snow, and she went down, hard, onto one knee. Her grip on the rope was the only thing in all the world that kept her from sliding away, down the slope, into the white, and gone. Elias's steady weight, behind her on the line, held it, held her. She was back up on her feet in 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, with her knee driven down into the ice, and the whole storm pressing on every surface of her body, and the rough rope biting into both her hands, she thought of Everett, not of his death, not this time, of the door, and the wind, and the terrible morning after. She thought of an afternoon, a warm afternoon, long, long ago, on a high ridge in some other greener country of her memory, the survey tools laid out on the ground between them, and Everett raising one hand to shade his eyes against the low gold light of the sun, and turning to look at her, wearing that particular expression he always wore in the moment right before he asked her what she thought about something, and she had not answered him quickly enough. She had still been looking out at the land, reading the shape of it, the way she always did, and she thought, kneeling there in the killing storm, of just how very many of their ordinary afternoons together she had spent looking out at the land, and not at him. You do not know, she thought. You never once know, in the moment, which of the ordinary afternoons is going to be the one you spend the rest of your life reaching back toward. Then Elias's hand found her shoulder from behind, and she was up, and she was moving again, up the slope, toward the small warm point of lamplight, glowing amber in the mouth of the hollow, high above them in the roaring white. They reached it. They brought the whole family in through the great oak door, and Boone rose up from beside the stove on his 2 ruined legs, and he saw his wife and his 3 children, alive and whole, coming in out of the storm. And the sound that came out of that hard and proud man was not a word at all. It had no words anywhere in it. It was older than words. The widow looked away, to give him the privacy of it, the door that would not open, had opened. This time, this one time, it had opened. By the fourth day, there were more than a dozen souls inside the hollow. They kept on coming, one at a time, and in small broken groups, following the rope up out of the white. People who had held out, stubborn in their own good square houses, for just as long as those houses would let them, and not 1 hour longer. And still they came, each one arriving with a fragment of the same dark story, carried up the slope. This roof, fallen, that chimney, torn away, this family, sheltering in a root cellar, that one in the stone foundation of the church. And each one, arriving, looked around the warm and holding stone of the hollow with the same slow, dawning understanding. The mad woman's cave, the fool's mistake, the only warm room now for miles in any direction. But the hollow was not endless, and by the deep of that fourth day, the widow was watching two numbers with a growing, private, and carefully hidden dread. The wood and the water. More than a dozen bodies now, and more coming. More than a dozen sets of lungs, breathing the warm air, drinking it down. More than a dozen souls to be kept, hour upon hour, above the thin line where the cold begins its quiet killing. The stove that had so easily held one small room now had to hold all of this, and the split wood in the entrance chamber, which had looked like such a mountain 3 days ago, an embarrassment of plenty, was going down. Faster than she liked, faster with each new body that came in through the door, trailing the cold in with it, needing to be warmed from the outside in. She did the arithmetic in her head, over and over and over again in the dark hours when the others slept. And the arithmetic was not kind. If the storm broke soon, within a day, then they would all of them see the far side of it. Every last one, man, woman, and child. But if it held on, one more day, 2 more, then somewhere out ahead of them all lay a harder, colder morning. A morning where the fire would have to be let down low, and the warmth shared out thin, and thinner still. She did not speak of any of this, not to Elias, not to anyone. A person does not spread that particular kind of fear into a room already full of frightened people. It helps no one. It saves no one. It only takes the little warmth they have left in them, and it burns it, for nothing. So she carried it alone, the way she had carried so very many things, alone, up onto that ridge. And then, in the black heart of the fourth night, the fever came. It was one of the smallest ones, a girl, no more than 4, perhaps 5 years old. She had come in the day before, with a family from the low road, cold, but seeming well enough. She had eaten a little. She had slept. And in the deep dark of the fourth night, she began to burn. Her mother woke the whole room with the sound of her own rising fear. The child was too hot, her small face flushed and damp. And then, in the space of a single terrible hour, too cold, shaking, her small eyes gone glassy and far away, and fixed on something up in the corner of the room that no one else in all the world could see. The mother clutched at her and rocked her and begged her, please to be still, please to stay. And the child only burned and shook and slipped, hour by hour, a little further away. And the widow felt the whole crowded room begin, slowly, to tip toward panic. She could feel it, the way the air changes before a storm. A dozen frightened people watching a child slip, beginning to feel the thin ice of their own safety cracking underneath them. If the child was not safe, this small, innocent thing, then none of them were safe. That was the fear moving through the room, silent and spreading. She knelt down beside the child, and Elias knelt down beside her. And in that moment, something passed between the two of them, again, without a single word. An old, old knowledge, his and hers, meeting in the middle of the lamplight. The knowledge of the marks on the wall, the knowledge of people who had waited out killing winters in stone long before anyone thought to build a square house on flat ground. Not the stove, the widow said, low, so that only he could hear it. She's too far gone for the stove now. Fast heat will stop her heart. Warm stone, Elias said, just as low. Wrapped, held against the body. Slow. My grandmother's people did it so. The widow nodded. It was the oldest medicine there was. They took stones from near the stove, warm, not hot, warm as a hand, warm as another body, and they wrapped each one in cloth, and they laid them gently against the child, at the chest, beneath the arms, at the small of the back, the secret places where the deep blood runs closest to the surface and carries the warmth inward to the core where it was needed. And they did not rush it. They let the warmth come into her slow, the way you let light into a dark room, a very little at a time, so as not to wound eyes that have been too long in the black. The widow held the child's small burning face between her two hands, and she spoke to her, low and steady and endless. Not words that meant anything at all. Words that meant only this: someone is here. Someone is holding on to you. You are not falling. And if you are falling, you are not falling alone. The mother knelt on the other side of the child, her whole body rigid with terror. And the widow reached across and took the mother's shaking hand and pressed it flat and gentle against the child's small chest, so that the mother could feel it for herself. The small heart beating, fast and thin, but beating, still there. The hours of that fourth night were the very longest of the whole storm. The room did not sleep. The room watched, a child and a widow and an old carpenter, fighting a quiet, wordless fight in the low amber light against something that had no shape and made no sound and could not be dug out with a spade or barred out with a heavy oak door. And somewhere in the darkest part of it, the part of the night that has no name, the hour when hope wears thinnest of all, when the lamp itself seems to burn lower, the fever broke. It broke the way ice breaks on a thawing pond in the first days of spring. All at once, almost silently, a quiet, sudden giving way. The child's shaking eased, and then, slowly, it stopped, and her far-gone glassy eyes came drifting back, at last, from wherever it was they had wandered off to, and they found her mother's face, hanging over her, and they knew it. And the child made a small sound, a tired, ordinary, complaining, absolutely wonderful little sound, and her mother folded down over her and wept without any noise at all, her whole body shaking with the force of it, silent in the lamplight. And the widow sat slowly back on her heels, and she let out a long breath, a breath she felt distantly that she had been holding for the better part of 4 whole days. Elias put one hand briefly on her shoulder, and then he took it away again, and he rose quietly to go and see to the fire. And all through the crowded room, one by one, people began, at last, to breathe again. The panic ebbed back out of the air the way the tide goes out, slow, and then, all at once, and gone. The room had watched the worst thing it could imagine come for its smallest, weakest member. And it had watched the mad woman hold the door. Later, much later, in the gray and formless hush before what should have been a dawn, the widow sat alone by the stove. The child slept, safe and cool, against her mother. Boone's whole family slept, tangled together like puppies, along the west wall. Ruth and her boy, the frost-bitten clerk, all of them breathing, slow and deep and even, all of them in the amber light, alive. And the widow looked at them, at the whole strange, gathered, sleeping household of them. The men who had signed papers against her, the families who had repeated the ugly names in the street, the clerk who had stamped her home unfit, all of them now, sleeping soundly under the stone that she had built, warm, breathing, kept, held. She was so tired that the tiredness had gone all the way through her and come out the far side of itself into a strange and terrible kind of clarity. She thought of Everett. She thought of the door. She thought of a night, 2 winters gone now, when she had thrown her whole body against wood that would not give, and screamed a beloved name into a wind that would not carry it 1 single inch. She had not been able to open that door, not for the one person in all the wide world that she would have given anything, everything, to reach. But this night, this long and terrible night, she had opened this one again and again and again, all the night through, for strangers, for the frightened, for the cold, for the very people who had stood in her home and called her a fool to her face. And she understood, sitting there alone in the low and holding light, a thing she had never once let herself fully understand before. She had not built this hollow to keep the winter out, not truly. She had built it to open a door, the one door she had not been able to open before, the one that had haunted every hour of her 2 long years. She had built a whole house inside a rock. She had endured a whole town's scorn. She had watched the sky and filled her careful book with numbers, also that when the worst night finally came, and she had always known that it would come, there would be a door. And it would open, and every single soul now sleeping, safe and warm, inside these stone walls, was in some quiet and unspoken and unrepayable way, for him. Outside, far beyond the great oak door, the storm went on, still blind, still tireless. But something in it had changed at last. It was no longer searching for a way in. It had begun, at the very end of that long night, to spend itself, to loosen its grip, finger by finger, on the world, to look, at last, for a way out. And the widow, in the warmth of the thing she had made, surrounded by the slow and even breathing of the saved, let her eyes fall closed, and at last she slept. The storm ended on the morning of the 8th day, not slowly, not with the long, gradual fading that sometimes marks the tale of such things. It ended the way a sound ends when the thing making it is simply taken away, all at once, leaving behind a silence so complete that the silence had its own weight, its own strange presence in the room. The widow was awake when it happened. She heard the change, the sudden absence of the thing that had been pressing on the stone without pause for 8 long days. And she lay still for several minutes in the gray light, simply receiving the quiet, letting her body believe it. Then she rose, and she dressed, and she went to the entrance chamber, and she lifted the bar on the great oak door, and she pushed it open. The world outside had been remade, white, and still, and utterly, unrecognizably changed. The plain below had been carved by 8 days of wind into long sweeping ridges of hard-packed snow, curved forms that bore no relation at all to the flat ground that had lain there before. The road was gone. The fences were gone. And in the distance, the roof lines of the town stood up out of the white. Some of them where they should be, and some of them in shapes that told a story all on their own, a story that needed no telling. The widow stood in the entrance for a long time, looking at it. Elias came and stood beside her. He looked at the same view. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the view did not already hold, entire within itself. They came out of the hollow slowly over the next days, the saved, blinking in the hard white light, going down one by one to see what the winter had left them. And what the winter had left was not the same for everyone. The town had been hurt. The widow would not let herself soften it, even in her own mind. Houses had failed. Not every soul in that valley had found a rope or a root cellar or a stone foundation to hold them. Some had trusted the everyday, and the everyday had not been built to answer this. And she carried each one she learned of, quietly, in the same careful place where she carried Everett, not as numbers, as names. But the living came up the ridge, because word had gone through that broken town the way word does, faster even than the thaw, that the hollow had held, that the mad woman's cave had stood through all 8 days without so much as a crack, that more than 20 souls had walked out of it alive, including men who had signed their names against it. And so they came to see it, to stand in it, to lay a hand, as Ruth had once laid a hand, flat against the warm and living stone, and feel for themselves the thing they had all been so certain could not be true. They came humbled, and they came changed, and the widow received each of them the same way, without triumph, without a single word of "I told you," because she had never once been in it for that. She had been in it for a door that would open, and the door had opened. That was the whole of her satisfaction, and it was enough, and it left no room in her for anything smaller. Boone came back on his own, once he could walk again. He did not come to apologize. He had already said the thing that needed saying on the night his family came through the door. The single wordless sound, older than language, that the widow had turned away from, to give him the privacy of it. He came now with a different purpose. He came with his notebook. He stood in the entrance of the hollow, this proud man, and he turned the notebook over in his big carpenter's hands, and he said, "I have built a great many houses. I built them the way I was taught, and I built them true, and I built them square, and I built them well. He looked up at her. "But I built them all for the ordinary night," he said, "and I never once in 30 years asked myself what would happen on the other kind." The widow was quiet. "I'd like to learn," Boone said, and the words came hard to him. She could see what they cost. "If you'd be willing to teach a man who called you a fool to your face, I would like to learn how you did this." The widow looked at him for a long moment, and then she walked him through the hollow. From the entrance to the back wall, she showed him the double walls and the wool between them. She showed him the floor, raised up on its stone pillars, clear of the rising damp. She showed him the pipe, and the fitted stone, and the sealed joints. She showed him the great oak door. She did not do it as a woman being proven right. She did it the way a craftsman passes a craft along, plainly, generously, holding nothing back. And Boone wrote, page after page, in his careful, no longer trembling hand. He asked good questions, the kind that come from a man who has set down everything he thought he knew to make room for something new. And when he was done, he closed the notebook and he said, "How many of the houses still standing could be changed, made ready for the next one?" "Most of them," the widow said. "Some more than others. It depends on what the ground will bear." "I'd like to do that work," Boone said, "with you, if you'll have me." And the widow said that she would. Clara Whitfield came too, the teacher, the woman who had stood in front of a room of children and made the widow into a lesson about fear. She came up the slope on foot, and she stood in the entrance of the hollow, and her face was very red from the cold, and very still. And for a while she did not seem able to speak at all. Then she said, "I told my students that this place was fear, that it was grief, dressed up as wisdom, that a person who built a thing like this had lost their way." The widow waited. "I was describing myself," Clara said, quietly. "I was afraid of what it meant, that a woman working alone had seen a thing I could not see. And I took that fear, and I dressed it up in the language of progress and civilization, and I taught it to children, because those are words that carry weight in a schoolroom." The words fell into the quiet of the hollow and settled there among the stone. The widow could have let her stand in it, could have let the shame do its work. She did not. "When the weather clears," the widow said, "come back and bring something to write with. I'll show you what's here, all of it, and then you'll teach it, not as a curiosity, as a thing that is true." Clara looked at her, uncertain. "After what I said about you?" "Because of what you said," the widow answered. "You were the resistance. That is exactly why the children should hear it from you. They'll learn more from a person who was wrong and came to know it than they'll ever learn from a person who was right from the start." Clara's eyes filled. She nodded slowly. The nod of a person making a promise she means to keep for the rest of her life. And then, on a gray and quiet afternoon, near the end of it all, the last of them came up the slope. The widow saw her from a distance, a figure in a dark coat moving up the grade slowly, not with the frailty of the injured, with something heavier than that. The particular slowness of a person carrying a weight that is not in the body at all. Vivian Crane. Her store had failed in the storm, Her fine house had lost its roof on the 5th day. She had sheltered, at the last, in a neighbor's cellar. She had survived, but she had survived with nothing, and she had come at the end up the one slope in all that country she had sworn she would never climb. The widow went out to the entrance to meet her. The two women stood facing each other in the cold. The one who had tried, quietly, to close every door in the town, and the one who had opened hers to everyone in the end, even to this. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Vivian reached into her coat, and she drew out something small and worn and carried it forward and held it out. A photograph, old, creased soft at the corners from years of handling. The widow took it gently. A man's face looked out of it, younger, kind-eyed, a face from another season of the world. His name, Vivian said, and her careful voice, the voice that had cut so cleanly for so long, was not careful now. It was breaking. His name doesn't matter now. What matters is how he died. The widow said nothing. She only listened. There was a winter, Vivian said, a long time ago, longer ago than you'd think, to look at me now. And a man told him, a proud man, a man everyone trusted, that his house was built right, built square, built the way it had always been done. Her hands had begun to shake, and it was not enough, she said. When the true test came, it was not enough. And he was gone before the morning. And I have spent every year since telling myself that nothing could have saved him, that no one could have known, that the winter simply takes who it takes, and there is no answer to it, and no fault in it, and no other way. She lifted her eyes to the widow's face. And then you came, she said, and you built a door that opens, and you proved, in front of the whole town, in front of me, that there was another way, that there had always been another way. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. I did not hate you, Vivian said. I want you to understand that. I never hated you. I hated the truth of you. Because if you were right, then he did not have to die. And I could not carry that. So I tried to make you wrong. I tried to close every door in this town against you, so I would never have to open the one inside myself. The widow stood, holding the worn photograph of a stranger, dead in some long-ago winter, and she understood, at last, the shape of the thing that had been fighting her all along. It was not malice. It was grief, wearing malice like a coat, because the coat was warmer. The widow could have said many things. She could have named the years of quiet cruelty, the freight men turned away, the whispered word manageable, the campaign of concern, the two ugly names the town had hung on her home. She could have balanced the ledger. She had every right to. She did not. She looked down at the photograph, and then she looked at the woman before her, no longer an enemy, only another soul who had lost someone to a door that would not open, and had spent her whole life since building walls around the wound. The widow reached out, and she took Vivian Crane by the arm, gently. Come inside, she said. You're cold, and there's a fire. Vivian stared at her, as though the words themselves made no sense, as though, of all the things she had braced herself to receive on that slope, this was the one she had no defense against at all. After everything I know what you did, the widow said, not harsh, only true. And I know why now. That's the part that matters. She tightened her grip on the woman's arm. warm and firm. I lost mine to a door too. That's why I built this one. So come in out of the cold, Vivian. There's room. There's always been room. That was the whole point of it. And she led her in, past the great oak door, to the fire. And she pulled a chair up beside her own, and she set the old woman down in it, and she wrapped a blanket around those thin, shaking shoulders. And Vivian Crane, who had spent a lifetime keeping her face a careful mask, put her 2 hands over that face at last, and let it break. And the widow did not rub her back, or tell her it was all right, or fill the moment with words. She only sat beside her, and let her weep for a man who had died in a winter, long ago, in a house that had been built for the ordinary night, because some doors do not open with a shoulder, and a latch, and a spade. Some doors only open like this, by one person choosing, against every right they hold to do otherwise, to lay down the ledger, and offer the fire instead. The spring, when it finally came the way spring comes after a hard winter, not with warmth exactly, but with the slow withdrawal of the cold, a gradual permission granted to the world for things to begin again. And things did begin again. Boone worked all that season with a changed pair of hands. He went house to house through the county, and where a home could be made ready for what the world might one day send, he made it ready. Earthen banks along the north walls, deeper entryways to break the wind before it reached the door, chimneys rebuilt to draw clean and true, storage set down into the steady ground, and beside him, more often than not, worked Elias Crow. The town had needed him in the storm, and having needed him, it could not afterward quite go back to looking through him. He was not celebrated. Frontier places do not have much vocabulary for celebration, but he was given work, serious work, work that mattered, and the houses he built were sound, and that was the shape the town's apology took. In the end, not words, but a place at last made for a man who had always deserved one. She stood before the marker on a gray morning near the end of that first year. The rock endured, it read, when the ordinary would not. Here, one woman listened to the winter and built a door that would open. The widow read it once, and she did not feel triumphant. She thought of Everett, of an afternoon on a high ridge long ago, and a man shading his eyes against the sun, turning to ask her what she thought. She had spent 2 years believing that she had failed him, that she had thrown herself against a door and lost, that the whole of her life since was only an argument with that one closed door, that one lost morning. But standing there, before the stone, she understood something new, something she had not been able to see until now, from inside her own grief. She had not been able to save Everett. That was true. It would always be true. No hollow, no door, no listening to the sky would ever change that one hard fact. But she had done a thing that grief, on its own, can never do. She had taken the worst night of her life, the closed door, the unanswered fist, the beloved name lost to the wind, and she had not let it end in her. She had turned it, over 2 long and lonely years, into a thing that opened, into stone that held, into warmth for the cold, and shelter for the frightened, and a door that answered when the fists came knocking in the dark. Everett's death had asked her a question, on that terrible morning, and it had taken her 2 years and a whole town's scorn and 8 days of storm to finally answer it. The answer was not, "I could have saved you." The answer was, "No one else will be lost the way you were lost. Not here, not now, not while there is stone to build with, and a door to hang, and one person willing to sit up through the night and listen for the knock." That was the answer. And it was enough. She turned from the marker, and she walked up the slope to the hollow, and she went inside. It was cool and quiet and dim. The stone held the temperature it had always held. A small fire moved in the stove, its light playing soft along the walls. Under a flat stone near the entrance, the 2 old papers still lay, one against the other, in the dark. Everett's name and a date. And beside it, the notice that had once declared this place unfit. The widow knelt, and she drew out the second paper, the certification, the one that had called her home a mistake. And she looked at it for a long moment. This thing that had wounded her once, this little document, so full of a frightened man's certainty. It hardly mattered now. It had not mattered for some time. She did not tear it up. She was not that kind of woman. She only folded it once and set it aside on the shelf beside her field book and Everett's, a thing that had happened and been survived and outgrown. And Everett's paper she left where it was, in the dark, in the stone, in the one place in all the world where the cold could never reach it. She rose. Outside, the plain held its beauty and its danger in the same open hand it always had. The season was turning, soft and slow, toward the warmth. But there would be other winters. There would be other hard nights. The world had not changed its nature. It never would. But the hollow would be here, and the door would open. The widow set another small log on the fire, and she sat down beside it, in the quiet, in the warmth of the thing she had made. Not a monument to what she had lost. A door for everyone still out there who had yet to hear the knock.